Right now, 3 out of every 4 cattle in this country are standing on dried out, drought-stricken ground, not 1 in 5, which is normal, 3 in 4. And every single hot, rainless day this summer, those ranchers get pushed closer to a decision that will land directly in your grocery cart, a decision you won't feel for 2 months and won't stop feeling for 2 years. And here is the thing I want you to understand. The price you reach for at the meat counter in August or September is not being decided at the store. It is being decided right now, this week, in the soil of the Great Plains, in the reservoirs of the West, in the pasture grass that either greens up this spring or does not. Almost nobody connects those two things because the weather and the grocery bill feel like they live in completely different parts of your life. They do not. They are the same story, separated by a few months of lag time. It is late May. The summer pattern is locking in. And today I want to walk you through exactly how this summer's weather is going to land in your cart, which foods get hit first, which get hit later, and what you can actually do about it before the prices arrive. Let's get into it. I know how this sounds. Another video telling you groceries are going up. You have heard food prices are rising so many times it has stopped meaning anything. I get it. So let me be precise about why this is different. Because the usual story is about inflation and tariffs and supply chains, and those are real, but they are not what I am here to talk about. I am here to talk about the one input that the headlines keep treating as a footnote, and that is actually one of the biggest wild cards in the whole equation, the weather, and specifically the kind of summer the country is setting up for right now. Let me come back to that number from the very top, because it is the one that should stop you cold. Roughly 75% of the United States beef cow herd is currently sitting in drought conditions. The long-term average for this time of year is somewhere around 20%. So we are not a little above normal. We are nearly 4 times the normal amount of the nation's cattle country baking under dry conditions. And we are heading into the summer, the hottest, most evaporative, most punishing stretch of the year for pasture and water. Let me explain why that single statistic matters more for your grocery bill than almost anything else. Cattle are not like a vegetable crop you can replant next spring. A beef cow herd is built over years. When drought hits pasture, the grass that cattle graze on stops growing. Ranchers suddenly cannot feed their animals off the land, so they have 2 brutal options. Buy expensive feed to make up the difference, which destroys their margins, or sell off cattle early, including the breeding females, the cows that produce next year's calves. When ranchers are forced to sell breeding cows because they cannot feed them, they are not just shrinking this year's supply, they are cutting into the herd's ability to grow for years to come. This is exactly what happened starting in 2022, when a brutal drought forced producers to cull one of the largest shares of the national beef cow herd ever recorded. And the country has been living with the consequences ever since because you cannot rebuild a cattle herd in a season. It takes years. The herd is sitting near a multi-decade low right now, and producers have barely begun to rebuild. The reason your beef has been so expensive is that drought from years ago is still working its way through the system. Beef and veal prices were running roughly 12% above a year ago this spring, and the USDA is forecasting beef to climb further this year while cattle supplies stay tight. Now layer a fresh summer of drought on top of a herd that is already at its smallest in decades, and you can see the trap. Every dry month this summer is a month ranchers cannot rebuild, a month they may be forced to sell instead of grow, and that keeps beef prices elevated not just for this year but potentially for years down the road. That is the headline, but it is only one shelf in the store. Let me walk you through the rest of the aisle because the weather hits different foods in different ways and on completely different timelines, and understanding the timeline is the key to actually protecting yourself. Start with the foundation crop, corn. People think of corn as the stuff on the cob at a summer barbecue, but that is a tiny fraction of it. The vast majority of American corn is feed and ingredient corn, It feeds the cattle, the hogs, and the chickens, and it gets processed into the syrups, starches, and oils that are inside an enormous share of what is in a typical grocery cart. When corn has a bad year, it does not just raise the price of corn. It raises the cost of feeding every animal in the food system, which eventually pushes up meat, poultry, eggs, and dairy. And it raises the input cost for a huge swath of packaged and processed foods. The summer weather outlook calls for above-average heat across most of the country, and corn is brutally sensitive to heat and dryness during one specific window, its pollination period in the heart of summer. A stretch of extreme heat at exactly the wrong moment can knock a meaningful percentage off the yield of an entire region. We saw it in 2012, when a historic Midwest drought slashed corn yields, feed prices surged, and poultry prices jumped sharply in the aftermath. The good news this year, and I want to be fair about the good news, is that the Corn Belt entered the season in better shape than the Western Range, with planting off to a strong early start and the Midwest not expected to fall into deep drought early in the summer. The risk is not the start. The risk is what a hot summer does during that critical midsummer pollination window. That is the thing to watch, and it has not been decided yet. Now, wheat, which is the one most people never think about until they are buying bread, pasta, and cereal. Wheat conditions this spring told a much rougher story than corn. The winter wheat crop was rated dramatically worse than a year earlier, with a large share of it sitting in poor or very poor condition, driven by drought stress concentrated in the southern plains, places like West Texas that got hammered by dry conditions. And the price forecasts reflect that vulnerability. After several years of falling, farm-level wheat prices are forecast to turn back up this year, and the forecast range around that number is enormous, which is the statistical way of saying weather could push it almost anywhere. Wheat is globally traded and weather sensitive, so a bad heat and drought summer in the world's growing regions does not just raise the price of an American loaf, it ripples through everything made with flour. Then there is the West, and this is the quiet one that sneaks up on people. So much of the country's fruits, vegetables, nuts, and dairy comes out of California and the irrigated West. And here is the trap that is being set right now. It was reported that California had a strange winter, warm and wet, with plenty of rain and full reservoirs, which sounds great. But because it was so warm, there was effectively very little mountain snowpack. And snowpack is the slow-release water bank that farmers draw on through the hot, dry months of summer. Full reservoirs and empty mountains is a recipe that looks fine in spring and gets tight in late summer. When the snowpack is not there, farmers pump more groundwater, and pumping is energy-intensive and expensive, and those higher costs get baked into the price of produce, nuts, and dairy. Stack a hot summer on top of a thin snowpack, and the squeeze on Western agriculture intensifies exactly as the growing season peaks. And do not forget the things that are not even grown here. Coffee, cocoa, sugar, these are global commodities exquisitely sensitive to weather in their growing regions, and they have been climbing on the back of weather disruptions in the countries that produce them. Your morning coffee and your chocolate bar are weather stories too, just weather happening on the other side of the planet. Now here is the single most important concept in this entire video, and if you take one thing away, take this. Different foods hit your bill on completely different timelines, and that lag is the thing almost no coverage explains. When drought drives up feed and livestock costs, the USDA's own research has historically shown that meat, poultry, and dairy can show up at retail within roughly 2 months. That is fast. That is the price moving while the weather is still fresh in your memory. But the full effect of higher corn prices working through to packaged and processed foods, your cereal, your corn-based ingredients, your boxed and bagged staples, can take something like 10 to 12 months to fully move through to the shelf. 10 to 12 months. That means the heat of this summer does not just threaten your grocery bill in August. It threatens it well into next year, arriving quietly, a little at a time, long after everyone has stopped talking about the drought that caused it. The weather is loud and brief. The price effect is silent and slow. And that gap is exactly why people never connect the two. I also need to be straight with you about the wild cards stacked on top of the weather, because the weather does not act alone. Fertilizer supplies were reported to be running well below normal heading into the planting season, around 3/4 of normal at one point, right as Corn Belt farmers needed it most. When fertilizer is scarce and expensive, some farmers plant less or switch to crops that need less of it, and either choice can quietly shrink supply. Add in elevated fuel and transportation costs, and you have a situation where even a decent growing year carries upward pressure on price. The official forecasts for grocery inflation this year have been getting revised, with recent USDA outlooks landing in the low single digits for food at home, but carrying an unusually wide band of uncertainty, precisely because of weather, energy, and trade. When the experts give you a range that wide, they are telling you the weather is in the driver's seat. So let me be useful, because awareness without a plan is just stress, and I am not in the business of handing you stress. Here is your practical action list for protecting your food budget against a hot, volatile summer. First, understand the timeline so you can shop ahead of it, not behind it. Meat, poultry, and dairy respond fast to drought within a couple of months. So if this summer turns hot and dry across cattle country, the smart move is to buy and freeze beef and other meats before the late summer price step-up arrives, not after. A chest freezer pays for itself in a year like this. Watch the drought maps the same way you watch the forecast, because for meat, the drought map is the price map a couple of months early. Second, lean into the categories that are actually getting cheaper, because not everything goes up. Egg prices, for example, have been falling sharply and are forecast to drop significantly this year as production recovers from earlier shocks. When one protein gets cheaper while another gets more expensive, that is your signal to flex your meals toward the cheap one. Eggs, beans, and other plant proteins stretch a budget hard when beef is climbing. Third, buy storable staples on the slow timeline. Because processed and grain-based foods lag the weather by closer to a year, the price increases driven by this summer's heat will mostly show up later. That gives you a window. Rice, dried beans, pasta, flour, canned goods, and other shelf-stable basics bought now before the slow-moving price wave arrives are money in the bank, not hoarding, just smart, calm stocking of things that keep. Fourth, expect produce volatility from the West and shop seasonally and locally where you can. When Western water gets tight in late summer, certain fruits, vegetables, and nuts get pricier and less consistent. Buying what is in season in your own region and leaning on farmers markets and local growers insulates you from the long, expensive, energy-heavy supply chains that suffer most when the weather turns. And fifth, watch restaurant prices as the early warning system they are. Food away from home has been rising faster than groceries because restaurants carry labor and energy and equipment costs on top of the food itself, and those costs adjust slowly and stubbornly. When eating out gets noticeably more expensive, that is the broader cost pressure showing its hand, and it is a cue to shift more of your eating back to the home kitchen, where your dollar simply goes further. Here is the honest summary of where we stand. It is late May, and the summer is setting up hot across most of the country, with 3/4 of the nation's beef herd already in drought, a wheat crop that came into spring stressed and dry, a western water situation that looks fine on the surface and thin underneath, and a stack of non-weather pressures, fertilizer, fuel, transportation, sitting on top of all of it. The beef story is already locked in motion by years of drought and will be made better or worse by the weeks ahead. The corn story is still genuinely undecided and hangs on what the heat does during midsummer pollination. And the whole thing arrives at your grocery store on a delay, fast for meat and dairy, slow for everything in a box or a bag, which is exactly why the connection is so easy to miss. The weather you are watching this summer is not just about whether your weekend plans get rained out. It is about what you pay to feed your family for the next 12 months. So watch the drought maps. Buy ahead of the fast movers and stock the slow ones. Flex toward what is cheap and away from what is climbing. And understand that the most important thing happening to your grocery bill this year is not happening at the store. It is happening in the dirt and the heat and the rainfall of this summer right now, months before the price ever reaches the shelf. I will be tracking it all season, and I will bring you the updates as the pattern sharpens. Until then, stay smart, stay prepared, and never, ever let your guard down.